During this presentation, I'll be discussing two films. The first film will be Amistad. Amistad is a film about a tribe of people, a group of people, 52 people actually, that was kidnapped and taken from their homeland off the Ivory Coast by another village of people. They was traded off for guns to the Spaniards. The Spaniards was making a normal route, trade route through the west coast of Africa and through the West Indies and Cuba. And after they obtained these slaves on a route to Cuba, Cinque, one of the tribal leaders, found a way to pick the locks that had them tied to the bows of the ship. After he found the way, he picked the lock and freed himself. He freed his other tribal men, and they overthrew the crew of the ship, only leaving two behind. They kept the captain and his main henchman outside of Cuba. They try to make their way back home. Now, on the route back home, they was intercepted by U.S. Navy ships, which brought them back to America, and they was put on trial for piracy and mutiny of the Amistad, which they really wasn't crew members of the Amistad. They was not slaves members of the Amistad. They was just captives. They was victims of kidnapping on the Amistad during a period of time where the slave trade was banned, but they were still brought to America and put on trial for piracy and mutiny. The difficult part about that case, where they was trying to figure out who did they belong to, who had ownership over these slaves. They come from a free land. They was owned by no one, but by American rules and American laws and American views, somebody had to have some ownership over you. The Cuban government was claiming them. They was putting faulty papers and documents saying they had ownership to them, and that showed you how much of a commodity that the slave trade was. It was big business owning slaves, and you own that slave and you own the generations that follow. But nobody had a bill of sale for them. Actually, the Spanish, the ones that traded for them, but Queen Isabella II, too young to understand. She was too young to understand how the slave trade was deep rooted within the trade industry, and pretty much America took it on themselves to try to figure out, to get a understanding of how do we determine who's a slave and who's not a slave. Now, these captives, these kidnapped victims, was not slaves. They come from a free land. They didn't grow up in America. They was taken from their land and put on trial for fighting for their freedom. They was not happy being in captivity when they would come from a land where they is free to roam as they please. They were suppressed by political, socially, and economically, because they was viewed as slaves in a country they didn't belong to. Every time they come to trial, they would be looked at slaves fighting for a right that they didn't have. But really, they was free. They had the right to fight to be free. Now, Roger Sherman, he figured out a loophole to get them up out of there. He presented to the court that if you're not born a slave, how you gonna be a slave? If you're not born on a plantation, you're not a slave. So they didn't come from a plantation environment. They came from their own homeland, stolen and kidnapped illegally. But even after they won that case, it was still political factors behind that kept them from obtaining their freedom. Van Buren, the president at the time, he didn't want to spark a civil war, so he listened to those who gave him advice, and he put the whole uh, all the kidnapped victims back on trial again and through the Supreme Court, and let them decide what determines them to be free or slaves. And they came to the same consideration after a great uh, speech by John Quincy Adams, telling them about how the past was and how you can't enslave someone who has not been a slave before, who has not been oppressed or put in the system of this. They're not from there. They deserve to go back from there to their land, to where they were taken from. And he showed and convinced the court that they was innocent of all that because of piracy and mutiny, because they was fighting for their freedom. Now they get freed, and still Cinque decides he don't know if he want to go or continue to fight to be an activist for the freedoms of more black people. And that shows you the evolution of the whole system, how he came from fighting to get up out of there, and he still has some aspirations to want to stay and fight for the rights of other free men, for all men of color that wanted to get through the system. Damn, boy.